In a world of shadows, where fears take flight, let's journey through horrors in the dead of night. A car in the rain, under night's deep frown, drives alone, lost as the storm bears down. A child and a drain, where dark secrets float, in the echo of laughter, where nightmares gloat. Long halls of silence, where whispers call, echoing madness in the endless hall. In the ocean's embrace, where secrets dwell, beneath the waves lies a watery hell. Cornfields whisper under the moon's soft scorn. Secrets rustle in the stalks of corn. A cabin lies hidden where dark tales should, in the heart of the silent, ominous wood. In the mirror's gaze, where shadows dance, reflections twist in a ghostly trance. Through this rhyme of fear, our tales are spun. In the dance of shadows, our journey's just begun.
Sherry Roach was a 17-year-old living in a group home in San Mateo, California in 1976. She and her younger brother Jerry had endured a turbulent childhood in Santa Rosa, growing up in what Jerry described as a violent household. This instability led Sherry to spend time in multiple foster homes and group homes for her care and safety. However, these environments were, to put it mildly, less than ideal, and Sherry often ran away. Despite all these challenges, Sherry remained extremely close with her brother. Jerry recalled that whenever Sherry ran away, as she often did, she would always reach out to let him know she was safe. By June 1976, Sherry was staying at a group home in San Mateo. She also held a part-time job in San Francisco, which is about 20 miles away from San Mateo. She often relied on public transit or hitchhiking to get to and from work, the latter of which wasn't uncommon for teens in the 1970s. On the morning of June 8, 1976, Sherry left the group home to catch a bus to her job in San Francisco. It was a routine she had done many times before. However, on this day, she never arrived back at the group home. A counselor at the home reported Sherry missing when she failed to return from work as expected. When Sherry's disappearance was reported, the San Mateo Police Department launched an investigation, though by today's standards it was relatively limited. According to Detective Tom Paulin of the San Mateo Police Department, speaking in February 2020, quote, "The officers back in 1976 did a cursory interview with some people that either worked with her or that knew of her, and there weren't any substantial leads at that particular time." Reading between the lines, it appears that they simply assumed she was a runaway, and because she had little in the way of family to advocate for her, her case went cold. Indeed, Sherry had a known history of running away from home or foster placements, which may have led authorities to suspect she left voluntarily. However, given Sherry's pattern of always calling her brother when she ran off, the fact that no one heard from her at all after June 1976 was deeply alarming. This departure from her usual behavior suggested that Sherry hadn't simply started a new life elsewhere. Something had prevented her from making contact. Although the investigation went cold, it was never fully closed. Given that Sherry frequently hitchhiked, investigators considered the grim possibility that she could have fallen prey to a predator who targeted young women. As any true crime aficionado knows, California in the 1970s was the epicenter of a serial predator epidemic. Investigators also looked into unusual cases like the November 1978 Jonestown incident in Guyana, which involved many Bay Area residents. Yet upon further investigation, Sherry's name didn't appear on the lists of those who perished in that tragedy. Decades passed with little progress until a surprising new clue emerged in 2020. Sherry's mother, who still lived in Northern California, discovered an old photograph while going through family belongings. The photo, dated 1975 on the back, showed Sherry as a teenager, standing close to an unidentified young man with his arm around her shoulders. What made the discovery significant is that Sherry's family had never seen this picture before, nor did they recognize the man in it. In fact, relatives had only heard vague rumors back in the 1970s that Sherry might have had an older boyfriend, but they had no name or details. The newly unearthed photo was potentially one of the last pictures taken of Sherry before she disappeared, and the man beside her immediately became a person of interest. San Mateo police publicly released the photo in February 2020 in hopes that someone might identify the mystery man. Authorities have described him as a black male, likely in his early 20s and approximately 6 feet tall. Notably, the man has not officially been labeled a suspect, but given that he was apparently close to Sherry not long before she vanished, police consider him a critical witness at the very least. Despite the release of this picture, no new evidence has come from it, and the man has not been identified. The Bible John case refers to a series of 3 unsolved slayings of young women in Glasgow, Scotland, between 1968 and 1969. These crimes were all potentially carried out by the same seemingly religiously obsessed man. The victims were Patricia Docker, 25, Jemima MacDonald, 32, and Helen Puttock, 29. They were all mothers who had spent evenings at Glasgow's popular Barrowland Ballroom nightclub immediately before being slain. They were found beaten and strangled, and each woman was on her period at the time of death, a grim detail that later fueled theories about the perpetrator's motive. Patricia Docker, an auxiliary nurse, was the first known victim. On February 23, 1968, her body was found in a Glasgow alleyway near her home in the Battlefield district. Many of her personal belongings, including her clothing, handbag, and watch, were missing, suggesting the perp removed them from the scene. Initially, Docker's slaying received limited leads, and police struggled due to a lack of witnesses and physical evidence. Her parents had thought she went to a different dance hall that night, and it was over a week before a witness came forward to confirm seeing her at the Barrowland Ballroom. This fact led to a significant delay in the initial investigation, and the case went cold. In August 1969, a second attack re-energized the investigation. Jemima MacDonald, a 32-year-old mother of 3, spent the evening of Saturday, August 16, 1969, dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom. When she failed to return home, her sister grew concerned. Tragically, on August 18th, Jemima's body was discovered in an abandoned tenement building by her own sister after local children spoke of finding a body. Unlike Docker, she was found fully clothed, but investigators noted striking similarities between the two cases. Both women had spent their last evenings at the Barrowland, both were strangled, and were on their periods when slain. On October 31, 1969, the body of Helen Puttock was found behind her Glasgow home, marking the third and final known act of this perpetrator. Helen, 29, had also visited the Barrowland Ballroom the night before, accompanied by her sister, Jean Langford. And keep Jean Langford in mind, because her evidence is going to be extremely important going forward in this case. They met 2 men at the dance hall who both called themselves John. After midnight, the group of 4 left together. One man departed earlier to catch a bus, and Helen and Jean shared a taxi with the other John. During the taxi ride, this well-spoken man revealed oddly intense views. He spoke disapprovingly of married women attending nightclubs and dance halls and referenced the Bible, repeatedly remarking on Old Testament punishments for adultery. Jean also remembered that he mentioned he didn't drink on New Year's Eve because he preferred to spend his time praying. These comments made a strong impression on Jean. The man insisted on dropping Jean off first, even though her home was farther, leaving him alone with Helen. It was the last time Jean saw her sister alive. The next morning, Helen Puttock was found in her backyard, partially clothed and brutally beaten. With the third slaying's obvious parallels to the others, a young mother attacked after a Barrowland night out. Police were convinced they faced a serial perpetrator. The manhunt for Bible John escalated rapidly after Helen was discovered. Jean Langford provided a detailed description of the suspect, a tall, slim, well-dressed man in his mid-20s with short, reddish-blonde hair and overlapping front teeth. Detectives widely distributed the drawing. Interestingly, they noted that his hairstyle was so unfashionable that a local barber may recognize the cut, and ended up showing it to almost 500 local barbers, with no leads. The investigation soon became one of the most intensive ever seen in Scotland. Over 100 detectives were assigned full-time, and more than 50,000 witness statements were taken. Additionally, thousands of potential suspects were questioned within the first year. Undercover officers even patrolled Glasgow dance halls, including the Barrowland, hoping Bible John might return to his hunting ground. Despite the massive manhunt and numerous tips, no arrest was made. By the early 1970s, the trail had gone cold. Some officers theorized that the unknown perpetrator might have died, been incarcerated for another crime, or that he may have been investigated and ruled out as a suspect. And trust me, you're going to want to keep that last point in the back of your mind. Others thought he may have simply left the area, perhaps explaining why the slaying stopped as suddenly as they began. With no further cases linked to Bible John, the case gradually moved into the realm of speculation. One early avenue of suspicion was that the slayings might not have been the work of a random predator at all, but rather the result of separate domestic crimes. In later reviews of the case, some detectives noted that both Patricia Docker and Jemima MacDonald had troubled marital histories. Docker was estranged from her husband Alex at the time of her death. The two were in the process of divorce, and Alex was on leave in Glasgow that week. He was an early suspect, as investigators learned he had a potential motive and even checked into a hotel with another woman the day after Patricia's slaying. This was seen as perhaps a celebratory measure taken by Alex Docker, though nothing could be proven. Likewise, Jemima MacDonald had recently separated from her husband and moved back to Glasgow. These connections led some within law enforcement to believe that at least two of the three Bible John cases might actually have been unrelated attacks by people known to the victims. Another suspect emerged years after the Bible John terror, John Irvine McInnes, a former soldier and a cousin of a very senior Glasgow police official. McInnes was never publicly named during the original inquiry, but a secret 1995 review of the case zeroed in on him as a potential Bible John. Detectives in that review suspected that McInnes might have been the unidentified man in the taxi with Helen Puttock. Further, they even suggested that the original lead investigator, Joe Beatty, deliberately steered attention away from McInnes because McInnes's cousin was his friend. In 1995, police obtained permission to exhume John McInnes's body. McInnes had reached his end voluntarily in 1980. Thankfully, despite the Bible John slayings having taken place in the late 1960s, all biological evidence was preserved. The results were inconclusive and the genetic sample did not match, nor definitively exclude, McInnes. Notably, in a 2022 BBC podcast, the detectives who re-examined the case in 1995 indicated that they would have arrested McInnes for the slaying of Helen Puttock if he had been alive still. Notably and somewhat oddly, despite incredible improvements in DNA analysis since the mid-90s, the evidence hasn't been retested as yet. That said, the involvement of McInnes remains a controversial theory. While McInnes fit many aspects of the profile, such as being from a strict religious background, Jean Langford couldn't identify him conclusively as the man from the cab. The most famous theory to emerge in modern times is the possible link between Bible John and convicted serial perpetrator Peter Tobin. Tobin, who was from Glasgow, was found guilty of 3 slayings between 1991 and 2006. In 2006, after Tobin's arrest, detectives launched Operation Anagram to retrace his life and see if he could be tied to other unsolved crimes. Several intriguing connections came to light. Tobin had lived in Glasgow in the late 1960s, not far from the Barrowland. He even married his first wife in August 1969 after meeting her at the Barrowland Ballroom itself in 1968. Now, to be fair, this isn't quite as odd as I initially thought it was, given that the venue has a capacity of almost 2,000 people. Further, he was known for his violent hatred towards women. All 3 of his former wives later described the already violent Tobin flying into a rage when they were on their periods. Investigators have long suspected the Bible John perpetrator targeted his victims during this time of the month. This behavioral parallel, along with reports that Tobin was deeply religious, supported this theory. Further, Tobin was known to use the alias John Semple. Jean Langford couldn't remember the last name Bible John gave exactly, but believed that it was Templeton. Investigators and theorists have noted that Semple sounds extremely close to Temple. However, there's no hard evidence linking Tobin to the Bible John slayings, and there's good evidence that he didn't do it. Going against the theory is the fact that Tobin moved to Brighton, England in early August 1969. His ex-wife has vehemently denied he could have slipped away to Glasgow to commit the final 2 horrendous acts. Furthermore, Tobin was 5'6", and Jean Langford had remembered Bible John being a notably tall individual. I think it's also important to note that Tobin and Bible John simply really don't bear any meaningful physical resemblance. Tobin has dark hair and dark eyes, while Bible John, even when seen in low light, was identified as having reddish blonde hair and blue eyes. Interestingly, some investigators who've worked on the Bible John case have commented on the strong internal disagreements in the investigation over Tobin being Bible John. That said, the anti-Tobin camp appears to have won out, with the Tobin theory now largely being confined to amateur theories rather than official theories. Personally, I think John McInnes needs yet another glance with modernized forensic techniques. It's important to remember that all 3 of the women were young mothers. The authorities may be able to bring significant closure to their now adult children by using these modern techniques. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and most importantly, share this video with your friends and family. In May 1990, 19-year-old Chad Maurer disappeared from his hometown of Madison, Wisconsin, under mysterious circumstances. He had been on a lunch break from his new job at a bike shop when he left home to return to work, but he never arrived. 2 days later, on May 21st, Chad's body was discovered in his car inside an unlocked garage on Chicago's South Side, about 150 miles from Madison. Chicago authorities initially reported that Chad died by his own volition via carbon monoxide poisoning. In support of this, they noted that he was found in the driver's seat with the car's ignition on, the gas tank empty, and the battery was dead. No substances were found in his system, and at first glance there were no obvious fatal injuries, lending some credibility to the authorities' initial theory. Chad's shocked parents, however, immediately doubted that their son, an upbeat teen with plans to move to Colorado for college, would drive to an unfamiliar Chicago neighborhood to do that. Their suspicions would soon be bolstered by troubling evidence suggesting Chad's death wasn't voluntary at all. When Chad's parents viewed their son's body at the funeral home, they noticed clear signs of injury that had been overlooked. Chad's knuckles were skinned down to the bone and he had bruises on his face, indicating he'd been in a fight or struggle. The funeral home also noted significant bruising on Chad's lower abdominal area. These findings didn't square with the Chicago police's initial conclusion that there was no evidence of foul play or any trauma on the body. Additionally, Chad's clothing raised alarms. His shirt was stained with blood, further suggesting a violent altercation. Perhaps most puzzling, crime scene photos showed a jacket in the car that didn't belong to Chad. He hadn't even taken a coat when he left home that cool day, yet there was this unfamiliar jacket on the seat next to his body. When the Mowers asked Chicago police to examine this jacket, they learned it had gone missing. According to a Chicago detective, the car's window had been broken, and someone apparently stole the jacket before the vehicle could be towed to a secure facility. This loss of potential evidence heightened the family's concern that something criminal had happened. Faced with these inconsistencies, Chad's family urged their local authorities in Wisconsin to get involved. The Dane County coroner examined Chad's body and found additional injuries that the Chicago coroner hadn't documented. One critical detail emerged from the autopsy. The level of carbon monoxide in Chad's blood was 74%. Such a high concentration is well above what's typically seen in cases where people do it themselves. This suggested that Chad was unconscious when the car filled with carbon monoxide. In other words, it appeared Chad had been rendered unable to escape and then placed in the car. Confronted with this evidence of foul play, the Cook County medical examiner changed the manner of death to undetermined in 1991, and authorities launched a full renewed investigation. And of course, by this time, a year had passed since Chad's death, a fact which significantly hampered the investigation. With the case reopened, detectives explored how and why Chad Mauer ended up dead in Chicago. An early tip came in October 1990 after Chad's story was featured on a local Crime Stoppers TV segment. A caller alleged that Chad had become involved in a substance deal with some people living in his Madison apartment complex. These individuals had recently moved to Madison from Chicago's South Side. Chicago police had intelligence about a substance trafficking pipeline between Chicago and Madison. This raised the possibility that Chad might have been drawn into transporting illicit goods or acting as a driver for people involved in this trade. One of the detectives who had initially worked on the case theorized that someone could have offered the cash-strapped teen quick money. Chad had been trying to save for a move to Colorado and needed all the funds he could get. This detective speculated that Chad may have been eliminated upon his arrival in Chicago after he completed the delivery. Adding weight to this theory, one of Chad's friends later claimed that in 1989, Chad had been paid on 2 occasions to transport a street pharmacist from Madison to Milwaukee. Investigators identified 3 young men as potential suspects, the same individuals who had moved from Chicago to Madison shortly before Chad's death. However, police never found enough hard evidence to charge anyone in connection with the crime. Aside from the prevalent substance trafficking theory, several other ideas emerged about what could have happened. However, these theories are all incredibly speculative and don't appear to be based on any form of evidence whatsoever. For instance, one theory puts forward that he traveled to Chicago for a romantic encounter, but was slain by the boyfriend of the girl he was hooking up with. While this is an interesting hypothesis, it's essentially fiction entirely devoid of any connection to the facts of the case. On June 5, 1991, a security guard at a Super 8 motel near Interstates 40 and 25 in New Mexico checked room 233. The occupants of the room had long since failed to check out as scheduled. The room had been rented on June 3rd by a man under the name Eduardo Collin, who reserved it for 2 people for one night. When motel staff entered, they discovered a gruesome scene: a woman hanging from the shower head. Multiple empty alcohol bottles were found in the room, but no signs of a struggle were immediately apparent. The woman appeared to have been deceased for a couple of days, consistent with having died on June 3rd, the same night she checked in. Local police were called to the scene, and the death was initially treated as though she undertook the act herself. The body was in a state of decomposition due to the warm June temperatures and the room's air conditioning being off, suggesting she had died shortly after checking in. No identification was found with the body or in her belongings, and she was registered as a doe. In time, because of a crucial tip in 2021, she became informally known as Becca. The name investigators believe might be hers, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. The unidentified woman was described as a white or Hispanic female between 25 and 35 years old. She stood about 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed around 140 pounds. She had long, curly, strawberry blonde hair and hazel gray eyes. Her ears were pierced, and she had no tattoos or distinguishing scars noted beyond some minor abrasions on her face and leg. An autopsy revealed the presence of heroin in her system, although the medical examiner noted that the level was not lethal unless she had never used before. The official cause of death was asphyxiation by hanging. At the scene, investigators cataloged several personal items that could potentially offer clues to her identity. One of the most significant and haunting pieces of evidence was a photo booth picture discovered on a table in the room. The photo showed the unidentified woman smiling alongside an unknown man. Motel employees believed the man in the picture was the same person who checked in with her, Eduardo Collin, and that the photo was possibly taken at a mall shortly before her death. In addition, a small scale was found on the table with the name George Martinez scribbled on it. Given all the evidence, investigators strongly suspected the scale might have been used for less than legitimate purposes. Further, it was unclear who George Martinez was, or if that name was an alias. Complicating factors somewhat is the fact that George Martinez isn't exactly the most distinctive name in New Mexico. Despite these items and a clear photograph of the victim's face, identifying her proved difficult in 1991 and beyond. Her fingerprints and dental records were taken and compared against databases, but no match was found. DNA profiling was not done at the time, and later efforts were hampered by the fact that her remains were reportedly cremated, leaving only minimal biological samples for testing. That said, I did say, minimal biological samples, not none, and according to one source, some of the preserved evidence from the scene likely contains her DNA. From the outset, investigators faced two central mysteries: who this young woman was and how exactly she met her death. Detectives wondered why a woman traveling with a companion would end up dying alone, with no one reporting her passing. Eduardo was the only verified name authorities had, and he was considered a person of interest. Police are unsure whether Eduardo was simply a witness who fled to avoid involvement, or someone who might have played a role in the Jane Doe's fate. If the death was indeed by her own hand, Eduardo could potentially provide context about her state of mind or identity. If there was any suspicion of foul play, he would naturally be the prime suspect. Tracking him down, however, proved challenging, given the information he provided when signing into the motel was partially false. He did indeed provide his real name and a proper local address, but he listed a false license plate number for his vehicle. Years later, police eventually located his family, only to learn that he had allegedly died of natural causes in the interim. And I use allegedly here because I'm not able to confirm whether the authorities actually had independent confirmation that Eduardo passed away. Based on my reading of the reports and reading between the lines, it appears that way, but it's not possible to say with absolute certainty. But another mystery reared its head when the family was shown the photograph that the authorities believed depicted the Jane Doe with Eduardo. When shown the photo booth picture of Becca and the man, Eduardo's relatives insisted that the man was not Eduardo and that they did not recognize the woman. This family claim cast doubt on the motel staff's previous identification of the photo's male subject. It's possible the motel employees were mistaken due to seeing Eduardo only briefly, or perhaps the family might have been unwilling to admit his involvement even if he was deceased. A significant turn of events came in March 2021, when a new tip revitalized the investigation. According to Albuquerque police, an individual came forward with information suggesting that the unknown woman went by the name Becca and was originally from the Los Angeles area. At present, the case appears to have been at a bit of a standstill since this time. It's unclear if the authorities have been able to successfully extract a DNA profile or if they've retained a genetic genealogy company to help track the case. Even if there is actually no DNA left, I believe that there's a very good chance of solving this case regardless, given that we have a clear photograph of her. I think this case just needs more publicity and exposure for Becca's true identity to be restored to her. The unusual facial expression she's making in the picture is something of a double-edged sword. It's positive in the sense that her photograph attracts people to her story, generating more exposure. The downside, of course, is that we don't have a photograph of her with a more neutral expression to go along with it. The Glico Morinaga incident is one of the most notorious unsolved cases in Japanese crime history. Over a 17-month period, a mysterious group calling itself the Monster with 21 Faces carried out a campaign of kidnapping, blackmail, and product tampering against confectionery companies. The crime spree began with the bold kidnapping of a candy company president and escalated to threats of mass poisoning of candies sold nationwide. The culprits taunted the police with mockingly written letters and evaded capture at every turn. Despite an enormous investigation involving over 1 million officers and hundreds of thousands of leads, the perpetrators were never identified. And yes, I triple-checked that number. Over 1 million officers were involved in the investigation in some capacity from the period between 1984 to 2000, when the case closed. The incident began on March 18, 1984, when 2 masked men broke into the home of Katsuhisa Ezaki, the president of Ezaki Glico, the maker of popular candies like Pocky. Around 9 p.m., the intruders tied up Ezaki's wife and young daughter, then abducted Ezaki from his bathtub. He was driven to a warehouse in Osaka while still naked and held captive. The kidnappers soon issued a ransom demand to Glico. They wanted 1 billion yen in cash and 100 kilograms of gold bullion for Ezaki's safe return. However, Ezaki managed to escape on his own after about 3 days in captivity before any ransom was paid. He couldn't identify his captors, leaving police with few clues. This dramatic abduction of a high-profile executive sent shockwaves through Japan and set the stage for the strange campaign that followed. In the weeks after Ezaki's escape, Glico came under further attack. Several vehicles in Glico's factory parking lot were mysteriously set on fire. Afterwards, on April 16, 1984, a plastic container filled with hydrochloric acid was discovered inside a Glico office building in Ibaraki, the same city where Ezaki had been held. These acts of sabotage were clearly meant to intimidate the company. Around the same time, letters began to arrive that revealed the culprits had adopted the alias the Monster with 21 Faces, a name loosely borrowed from a character in Japanese fiction. Starting in April, the group sent a barrage of mocking letters to the police and the media, ridiculing the authorities' inability to catch them. In one taunting message addressed, quote, "To the police fools," the writers sneered, "Are you stupid? If you're real pros, try catching us." I have to assume that all sounded much more menacing in Japanese. They even gave cryptic hints about their methods, such as mentioning the type of car and equipment used in the kidnapping, though these clues proved useless. The brazen letters, written in an Osaka dialect, were published in newspapers and intensified public interest in the case. In May 1984, the monster with 21 faces escalated their campaign by threatening Japan's food supply. On May 10th, the group sent a letter directly to Glico's management, claiming they had laced Glico candies with a deadly cyanide compound. They warned that these poisoned candies would be placed on store shelves if their demands were not met. This threat forced Glico into a nationwide product recall. Supermarkets emptied their shelves of Glico's popular sweets, and panicked consumers avoided the brand. Although no actual cyanide-laced Glico products were ever found, the threat appears to have been a bluff. The scare inflicted massive financial damage on the company. Glico reportedly lost the equivalent of $20 million and had to lay off hundreds of workers. Notably, in a country where lifetime employment was seen as the norm, this had the additional effect of humiliating the executives. The monster with 21 faces seemed to revel in the chaos they caused. One letter even gloated over Glico's losses, as if the criminals' goal was to upend large food companies rather than simply collect a ransom and move on. By late June 1984, after several weeks of this torment, the shadowy group suddenly announced a ceasefire against Glico. In a message dated June 26th, they proclaimed they were, quote, forgiving Glico, and the harassment of that company abruptly stopped. Now, some have speculated that a ransom was actually paid here, but there's no evidence to suggest that actually happened. Glico and the public breathed a sigh of relief, but the monster with 21 faces was not finished. They were about to shift their focus to other targets. Notably, some have speculated that Glico had indeed paid a large ransom to the group without the knowledge of the public. After backing off Glico, the extortionists turned their attention to another confectionery giant, Morinaga and Company. In October 1984, a letter addressed to the, quote, moms of the nation warned that 20 packages of Morinaga candy had been laced with sodium cyanide. This time, the threat was real. Police scrambled to search stores from Tokyo to Osaka and discovered more than a dozen candy packages on shelves that had been tampered with. The group had indeed placed lethal doses of cyanide in popular Morinaga products. Interestingly, they helpfully affixed labels on the packages reading, quote, danger, contains toxins, apparently in an effort to prevent any actual harm. Fortunately, no one was poisoned, but the message was chillingly clear. The perpetrators even teased that next time, there may be no such labels, implying a future incident could be deadly. The discovery of poisoned candy caused widespread fear. Morinaga's products were boycotted by retailers, and the company had to slash production by 90% amidst the crisis. Notably, this was an even harder hit than suffered by Glico. The monster with 21 faces also issued direct extortion demands to Morinaga's leadership. On November 1st, 1984, the Morinaga Company's vice president received a letter threatening to destroy the company if a ransom of 200 million yen was not paid. This ransom amounted to approximately $850,000 in 1984, which, adjusting for inflation, is about $2.5 million. The letter even gave detailed instructions for how Morinaga should signal compliance. It told them to place a coded message as a missing person ad in a specific newspaper on a certain date. Morinaga followed the instructions and ran the ad with the secret keywords on November 6th, effectively agreeing to pay. However, the criminals never showed up to collect this money. Around this time, the group expanded their threats to other firms as well, sending similar letters to food companies like Marudai Ham and House Food Corporation. In one incident in June 1984, an undercover police officer posing as a Marudai employee attempted a ransom drop of 50 million yen. However, he noticed a suspicious quote-unquote fox-eyed man monitoring him. Police believed this individual was the mastermind, but he managed to elude capture. The inability to catch the monster with 21 faces became a major embarrassment for law enforcement. The cat-and-mouse game continued into mid-1985, with the criminals continuing to send letters and the police accumulating failure after failure. The stress culminated in a tragic event. In August 1985, the head of the Shiga Prefectural Police, Superintendent Shoji Yamamoto, immolated out of shame and remorse. Just 5 days later, on August 12, 1985, the shadowy extortionists sent what would be their final message. In it, they derided Yamamoto as stupid, but declared that they would halt their campaign. "We decided to forget about torturing food-making companies," the letter announced, claiming that if any similar crimes occurred in the future, it would be copycats and not them. The group's parting words were fittingly both smug and edgy, quote, "We are the bad guys. It's fun to lead a bad man's life." With this, the monster with 21 faces vanished as mysteriously as they had arrived. The crime spree that had terrorized Japan's candy industry for 17 months was over, and the perpetrators were never heard from again. In the aftermath, the investigation slowly went cold. The statute of limitations on the kidnapping of Katsuhisa Ezaki expired in 1994, and by 2000 all possible charges related to the case had reached their legal time limits. In February 2000, with the last statute of limitations running out, the National Police Agency formally conceded defeat in the case, an unprecedented admission of failure. With the culprits never identified, many theories have been proposed about who was behind the events and what their motives were. Investigators explored a wide range of possibilities during and after the case, but no theory could be proven. Anyway, with that said, let's dive into the most plausible theories on this case. One theory is that an organized crime group, or Yakuza gang, orchestrated the extortion campaign. The elaborate planning and daring actions, kidnapping a CEO and executing complex ransom schemes, led police to initially suspect Yakuza involvement. In fact, one early suspect was Manabu Miyazaki, the son of a known Yakuza boss, who bore a resemblance to composite sketches of the fox-eyed suspect. He had a history of anti-police activism and even a past dispute with Glyco, making him seem like a plausible mastermind. However, Miyazaki was cleared after providing alibis, and no direct links to any Yakuza organization were ever proven. While the Yakuza are known for corporate extortion, their typical style is to operate covertly for profit, rather than drawing intense police attention with public taunts. The monster with 21 faces behaved in a way that was atypical of organized crime syndicates, and investigators ultimately found no solid evidence that any established gang was behind it. Organized crime involvement remains a possibility, but if a Yakuza group was involved, they acted very much out of character and were extraordinarily careful to leave no trace. Another line of speculation is that someone with inside knowledge of the targeted companies was acting out a vendetta of sorts. Some thought a disgruntled Glyco employee or ex-employee might have been seeking revenge, or had a grudge against the company's leadership. Notably, Glyco's president had been involved in a labor dispute about a decade earlier, which initially pointed suspicion toward individuals connected to that incident. Others even questioned if Ezaki himself or someone in his family could have staged the kidnapping, though Ezaki firmly denied any such implication and was cleared by police. There were also whispers about possible leaks from within law enforcement, given how the culprits always seemed one step ahead. However, no proof of a police insider was ever uncovered. That said, given the magnitude of the investigation and the amount of officers involved, it does remain a very real possibility. In the end, while an inside job can't be ruled out, exhaustive interviews and background checks on company staff didn't yield any suspects. Some theories claim that rival companies engaged in corporate sabotage to damage Glico and Morinaga for competitive or financial gain. The confectionery market is big business, and Glyco's near-crippling losses during the incident could have benefited its competitors. One variant of this theory suggests a stock manipulation scheme. An investor or group might have shorted Morinaga's stock. Given that they knew the share value would plunge, they could have escaped with a quick profit. Indeed, Morinaga's stock did fall drastically during the panic, which could have yielded huge profits for anyone forewarned of the terror campaign. However, investigators looked into individuals who traded unusually in those stocks and found no conclusive evidence of such a plot. And as hinted at already, this strategy has a major flaw in that any meaningfully large fortuitous trade would have set off alarm bells immediately. Anyone with sufficient knowledge of the stock market to be shorting stocks in the 1980s would likely have been keenly aware of this issue. Despite the plural 21 Faces moniker, some have wondered if the mastermind could have been a lone wolf acting solely on a personal agenda. The supposed gang's dramatic flair and the literary reference in their name hint at a vigilante element. Some have speculated that this was someone driven by a personal sense of superiority over the authorities. The letters displayed an almost game-like attitude toward outwitting the police, suggesting a potential lone wolf who derived a thrill from the chase itself. Perhaps the most interesting theory is that the entire thing was a North Korean psychological attack on the Japanese populace. North Korean agents abducted Japanese citizens in the 1980s and definitely had the resources for such operations. Ultimately, every theory has run into the same wall, a lack of proof, and the true identity of the perpetrators remains unknown at present. In May 2004, one of the most peculiar mysteries in Formula One history unfolded on the streets of Monaco. The Jaguar racing team had taken the unprecedented step of mounting a large, valuable diamond on the nose of their Formula One car as part of a glitzy promotional stunt. During the Monaco Grand Prix, a crash sent that jewel flying and sparked a mystery that's gone on for more than 2 decades. The decision to put a diamond on a Formula One car was born out of a high-profile marketing partnership. Jaguar's Formula One team, under pressure to increase its profile and please sponsors, struck a deal to promote the Hollywood heist film Ocean's 12 during the Monaco Grand Prix. Monaco's race, known for glamour and celebrity attendance, was seen as the perfect stage for an attention-grabbing stunt. Jaguar collaborated with an international diamond company, which provided a set of flawless diamonds to be used over the race weekend. Each Jaguar car would carry one of these gems in its nose cone during the Grand Prix. These were no fake crystals or low-value props. Each stone was a genuine diamond valued at around $250,000 at the time. The use of real jewels was intentional, and the risk was part of the appeal. A costly gem on the front of an F1 car added real jeopardy to the promotion. Not surprisingly, no insurer would underwrite such a stunt, and Jaguar acknowledged that losing the diamond was a calculated risk they had accepted from the start. With the world's attention on Monaco, the stage was set for what was either a massive, unintentional publicity coup or a costly misadventure. On Sunday, May 23, 2004, the Monaco Grand Prix got underway after a couple of failed start attempts. Christian Klein, a rookie driver for Jaguar, started near the back of the grid. Within the first minute of racing, trouble struck hard. Klein's vehicle ended up tangled with a Jordan car driven by Nick Heidfeld, a German driver. The contact broke Klein's front wing, which became wedged under his front wheels, robbing him of steering and braking. Essentially a passenger at that point, Klein went straight ahead and slammed nose first into a barrier. The impact ended his race on the first lap. The car's nose cone, carrying the diamond, was buried in the tire wall after the crash, and circuit marshals quickly moved in under yellow flags to clear the wreck. Klein was uninjured, but Jaguar's bold PR jewel was now in jeopardy. Immediately, Jaguar team members and management were concerned not just with their driver's health, but with the fate of the precious uninsured stone. Notably, one of the Jaguar managers is on record saying that his immediate concern was for the diamond, not for Klein, which is a heck of a thing to admit publicly. Safety regulations prevented the team from joining the trackside recovery during the race. The shattered car was hoisted away by crane, and the race continued as Jaguar anxiously awaited the chance to inspect the nose. It was only after the Grand Prix had finished, roughly 2 hours later, that Jaguar personnel finally accessed the retrieved car. To their dismay, the diamond was nowhere to be found. The gemstone that had been securely fastened into the nose cone before the race had vanished at some point during the crash and its aftermath. News of the missing $250,000 gem quickly made headlines, adding a dramatic twist to Jaguar's promotional gamble. Spectators near the crash site had reportedly even scoured the area in the aftermath, hoping to spot the glittering prize. With the Jaguar diamond officially missing, several theories emerged to explain what might have happened to it. One straightforward possibility is that the diamond was simply lost in the crash, never to be recovered, with no foul play involved. The impact at the barrier could have dislodged the diamond, sending it flying into an area where it was effectively irretrievable. In that scenario, the small gem could have been overlooked amid the debris. It might have ended up swept aside with other shattered car parts when the track was cleaned, potentially ending up in the trash. The most popular theory, and the one initially assumed by Jaguar's team, is that someone at the scene picked up the diamond and kept it. A Formula One crash draws plenty of eyes, and Monaco's track is lined with spectators and marshals in close proximity. When Klein crashed, pieces of his car, including that nose tip with the diamond, were scattered. A quick-thinking track marshal or an enterprising spectator could have spotted the glittering stone and pocketed it before officials knew it was gone. Given the value of the diamond, such a finder would have strong incentive to keep it secret and perhaps sell it quietly at a much later date. There were hundreds of people in the vicinity that day, and any one of them might have picked up a tiny gem without being noticed. Despite the strong likelihood of an opportunistic grab, no culprit has ever come forward, and the missing jewel has never been traced. The theft theory thus remains unproven, but very much alive in fans' minds. Another line of speculation is that the disappearance was not entirely a random accident or opportunistic theft, but involved some inside knowledge or planning. One version of this theory suggests that Jaguar and its partners might not have been as reckless as they appeared. Under this theory, when they couldn't obtain insurance for it, they put on a replica diamond. This replica, not having the hardness or other qualities of an actual diamond, may have simply shattered in the incident. Supporters of this theory question why race officials would have allowed Jaguar to affix an ultra-hard small projectile to the nose cone to begin with. But perhaps the most far-out theory of all is that Jaguar put a fake diamond on the nose cone of a rookie driver, knowing that he was far more likely to crash than a veteran driver. Under this theory, the real PR stunt wasn't putting the diamond on the vehicle, but the media coverage surrounding the loss of the diamond. On March 21, 2000, 23-year-old Greg Weiss Jr. left his father's home in Princeton, Louisiana, intending to visit a friend in the nearby community of Taylortown. He was last seen in the early evening that day, driving on U.S. Highway 71 near the intersection with Willis Road and Highway 527. According to a friend, Greg was dropped off at a bar along Louisiana Highway 1 later that evening. After that point, Greg Weiss Jr. vanished and was never heard from again. When his family realized he hadn't returned home or contacted anyone, they grew concerned and reported him missing. Just a few days after Greg's disappearance, on March 24, 2000, a critical discovery was made. Greg's dark brown 1984 Chevy pickup truck was found abandoned on a roadside in the Taylortown area. Inside the vehicle, investigators found Greg's wallet and other personal belongings, but no sign of Greg himself. The truck appeared to be in working condition, and there were no immediate indications of a struggle at the scene. The fact that his vehicle and wallet were left behind suggested that something unexpected had happened. Given these circumstances, the Bossier Parish Sheriff's Office quickly began treating Greg Weiss's disappearance as a possible case of foul play. In the days and weeks following Greg's disappearance, law enforcement officers undertook extensive efforts to find him. They interviewed the friend who last saw Greg and followed up on the account that Greg had been left at a bar on Highway 1 that night. Investigators canvassed the bar and surrounding areas, hoping to find anyone who might have seen Greg after he was purportedly dropped off, but found no evidence that he was there. Police also extensively searched the vicinity where Greg's pickup truck was found abandoned, looking for any clues or evidence, but again found no further evidence. As of now, there's no indication as to what may have happened to Greg, and his case has attracted surprisingly little attention in the media and online. Rona Louise Monison was an 18-year-old freshman at the University of South Florida in 1972. Originally from Long Island, New York, she had moved to Tampa for college and lived in a campus dormitory. On the morning of October 2nd, 1972, Rona told friends she was heading out to a local store on an errand and would be back shortly. She drove off in her gray Chevrolet Impala, but never returned to her dorm room. When Rona failed to come back or contact anyone, her friends grew concerned. It quickly became apparent that the college student had vanished without a trace, leaving investigators baffled as to how an ordinary trip to the store ended in her disappearance. For 3 days, friends and authorities anxiously searched for Rona. Their worst fears were confirmed on October 5th, 1972, when Rona's lifeless body was discovered in a pond about half a mile north of Skipper Road and 30th Street, just outside the USF campus. An autopsy revealed she had died from blunt force trauma in a brutal assault. The location of her body, thrown into a remote pond, suggested the perpetrator took fairly significant efforts to conceal the crime. Rona's car was found abandoned at a nearby apartment complex parking lot, adding another layer to the mystery. Investigators processed the Impala for clues, but whatever evidence they found wasn't enough to identify a suspect. Police didn't publicly name any person of interest, and no obvious motive, such as robbery or personal vendetta, was apparent. With so many unanswered questions, various theories about what happened to Rona Monison have emerged over time. One possibility is that Rona fell victim to a chance encounter with a violent stranger. She disappeared during a routine errand, and there were no immediate suspects, which suggests a random predator might have crossed her path. This theory supposes that an opportunistic attacker abducted Rona near the store or along her drive, inflicted the blunt force injuries, and then dumped her body in the pond to hide the crime. Others have speculated that someone Rona knew, perhaps a fellow student or an acquaintance from the area, could have lured or coerced her. Given the time frame, some have wondered if Rona's slaying might be linked to other unsolved cases or serial offenders operating in Florida in the early 1970s. Her death occurred just weeks after the unsolved abduction of 13-year-old Gail Joyner in the same area, leading some to question if a single offender could be responsible for both. Those who support this theory suggest that Gerald Stano, a relatively unknown but extremely prolific offender, may have been responsible for the slaying. Despite these theories, investigators have never confirmed any specific suspect or motive in this case. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just reminding you to subscribe and share if you've made it this far. Anyway, let's get back to the content. The Knights Templar, a famous medieval military order, have long been the subject of legend and theories. One of the most persistent claims is that the Templars secretly worshipped a mysterious idol called Baphomet, a charge first levied against them during their 14th century trials. The term Baphomet first appeared decades before the Templars' trials during the Crusades. In a 1098 letter, a crusader described the Muslim Turks at the siege of Antioch, calling upon Baphomet, which most scholars interpret as a corruption of Muhammad. Medieval European crusaders generally mischaracterized Islam as idolatry. They believed Muslims worshipped Muhammad as their god. By the late 13th and early 14th century, Baphomet had thus entered the Christian lexicon as a term connoting a pagan or false idol. Against this backdrop, the Knights Templar fell under suspicion. On October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of the Templars in France, motivated largely by his debts to the wealthy order and a desire to seize their assets. Philip, with the cooperation of Pope Clement V's inquisitors, accused the Templars of numerous heresies. Over 100 charges were leveled against the order, including denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, illicit practices, and worshipping an idol named Baphomet. Notably, many of these accusations mirrored those earlier aimed at other enemies of the Church, such as the Cathars, suggesting a template of charges rather than unique misdeeds. Under the pressure of torture and imprisonment by the medieval Inquisition, some Templars confessed to these charges. The idol of Baphomet featured in several such confessions, though descriptions of it varied wildly. According to the trial records, different Templars gave contradictory accounts. Some described a head, others an idol with 3 faces, and others spoke of a human skull or a cat figure as the object of veneration. It's important to note that no physical idol or tangible evidence of Baphomet was ever produced. The name Baphomet itself didn't even appear in the initial arrest warrants or the formal papal charges. Those documents only generically accused the Templars of adoration of idols. The specific name emerged from the interrogations, suggesting it was driven by the questions or expectations of the inquisitors. Of 231 knights interrogated in Paris, only 12, barely 5%, confessed, under torture, to knowing anything about Baphomet. Notably, far greater numbers confessed to other charges, such as more routine claims of blasphemy. This disparity indicates that even under extreme duress, the Baphomet charge was not widely substantiated compared to more mundane forced confessions. However, the inquisitors didn't take this to mean that Baphomet didn't exist as an object of worship, but rather that the Templars held Baphomet so dear they wouldn't name the idol. During the trials, many Templars withdrew or recanted their confessions when not facing torture, and contemporaries were often skeptical of the more outlandish accusations. Even Pope Clement V initially doubted Philip's allegations. Outside France, papal investigations in other regions such as England, Portugal, and the Holy Roman Empire found little evidence of heresy. Many Templars in those regions were eventually exonerated or given light penances. In France, however, Philip's political pressure prevailed. The Templars' Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, after years of imprisonment, dramatically retracted his forced confession and declared the order's innocence. For his audacity, he was put to the torch in 1314. Modern historians widely agree that the Templars' supposed worship of Baphomet was a false charge lacking any genuine proof. The overwhelming consensus was that the confessions were both coerced and unreliable, and relied upon typical methods associated with the Inquisition. Notably, many contemporaries didn't believe the Baphomet confessions to be legitimate. However, they did suspect that many Templars had become crypto-Muslims. Modern historians generally dismiss the idea that the Templars would suddenly, en masse, adopt the doctrines of their mortal enemies. That said, there were cases of individual Templars converting to Islam, Robert of St. Albans, an English Templar, became Muslim and joined up with Saladin in the 1180s. For this action, he was granted the right to marry one of Saladin's relatives. These acts shocked Christendom and may have led to the idea that Templars harbored secret sympathy for their enemies. Importantly, no credible evidence has ever emerged that the Templars venerated anything called Baphomet. Although the Templars were dissolved, then subsequently exonerated by the Church in later years, the lurid idea of their occult practices didn't vanish. After centuries of obscurity, the Baphomet legend was revived in the 19th century amid a resurgence of interest in the Templars, Freemasonry, and the occult. Enlightenment and Romantic-era writers began speculating about what hidden wisdom the Templars might have possessed. In 1818, Austrian Orientalist Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall published an essay that claimed to find Templar Baphomet idols and linked the order to Gnostic sects. Famously, a major turning point came with French occultist Eliphas Levi. In the mid-19th century, he famously illustrated Baphomet as the Sabbatic goat, a winged, goat-headed androgynous figure laden with esoteric symbolism. Levi took the name Baphomet, which he believed the Templars had used, and transformed it into a symbol of cosmic balance in his occult philosophy. Since this time, Levi's goat-like depiction of Baphomet has become the best-known image of this entity. That said, it's important to remember that the Sabbatic goat was never historically associated with the Templars, nor was it based on contemporary Inquisition accusations. The idea that the Templars worshipped a demon named Baphomet is in essence a myth, but it's a myth that still has a ton of cultural weight almost a millennium later. On September 22, 1972, 13-year-old Gail Joyner returned home from school in Thonotosassa, Florida, ate a sandwich, and then headed out to walk her pet raccoon, Bandit, on a leash. She strolled barefoot down the rural road near her home and was never seen again. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing Gail that afternoon standing by a white car near a wooded area, speaking with an unidentified person. However, no one saw her actually enter the vehicle. When Gail didn't return home, her family grew concerned and contacted the authorities. She had left behind her shoes and all her personal belongings, strengthening fears that she hadn't run away voluntarily. Gail's parents insisted to the police she wouldn't have left on her own. After all, she was happy at home and very close to her siblings. Early on, the authorities suspected foul play. Perhaps someone had lured the friendly girl by showing interest in Bandit, a pet she loved to show off to anyone who asked. As night fell on September 22nd, a search effort began and intensified over the next days. Law enforcement and volunteers mobilized a massive search of the area. More than 150 people scoured the woods and roads on foot and horseback, and helicopters flew over the surrounding terrain. Divers and deputies also searched local waterways, including nearby Lake Thonotosassa, in case Gail or her pet had fallen in. A very odd tip came in on September 25th, 1972, that gave a glimmer of hope from a woman driving in the area. This witness reported seeing a girl matching Gail's description, wandering near an orange grove wearing nothing but sheets of newspaper. For reasons that make no sense to me, the woman didn't stop to approach the girl immediately. Investigators rushed to that area, but they found no sign of Gail or whoever the girl was. By the end of that first week, authorities publicly acknowledged what everyone feared. They believed Gail had been abducted by an unknown individual. Witnesses had described the suspicious car as a small white 1960s Chevy sedan or similar model. They also described a possible suspect, who was described as a young white male in his mid to late 20s with short dark hair and long sideburns, seen leaning against the car in the area. With these leads, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office pursued tips and conducted interviews, but progress was painfully slow. Investigators even went so far as to collect 17 raccoon carcasses found in the vicinity, hoping one might be Bandit, which had identifiable scars on his foot and nose. Unfortunately, Gail's family did not recognize any of them as her pet, eliminating that potential trail. As weeks turned into months, the case grew cold. No suspect was identified, and no body or physical evidence turned up. Within a month of Gail's disappearance, active investigative efforts were scaled back due to the lack of new leads. A decade later, an unexpected development briefly renewed hope. In October 1982, convicted serial perpetrator Gerald Stano, who was already behind bars in Florida, confessed to slaying Gail. Stano was a notorious predator who had confessed to slaying dozens of young women across several states. In fact, he claimed responsibility for as many as 41 slayings, though only 23 were ever confirmed. As part of his 1982 confession, Stano provided details about Gail's case, and even pointed investigators to a location where he said he had left her remains. In January 1983, he was transported to Hillsborough County to assist in the search, and he led deputies to an area about a mile from where Gail was last seen. For a moment, it seemed like the mystery might finally be solved. Despite this dramatic turn, the outcome was disappointing. A thorough search of the spot he identified turned up nothing. There were no remains and no evidence connected to Gail. Subsequently, Stano abruptly recanted his confession. Investigators were left uncertain whether Stano had truly been involved or if he was fabricating the story. Stano was known to confess to crimes he had no direct link to, and authorities have noted that at least some of his many admissions were dubious or outright false. In Gail's case, detectives remarked that Stano did know certain details that only the perpetrator would know, which lent some credibility to his account. However, without any physical evidence, they couldn't verify his claims. Stano was never charged in connection with Gail Joyner's disappearance, and he was eliminated in 1998 for his other disturbing acts. Some have theorized that he may have interacted with the real individual responsible for Gail's disappearance while in prison, which is why he had some but not all of the details. Further observers have noted that Gail would have been an extremely significant outlier in terms of the age of his victims. Most of Stano's victims were in their late teens or early adulthood, and none of his confirmed victims were near Gail's age. In the absence of a definitive resolution, several theories have shaped public understanding of what happened to Gail Joyner. The prevailing belief, supported by investigators and the family, is that Gail was the victim of an abductor who likely exploited her trust. The detail of Bandit, the pet raccoon, is often highlighted in discussions of the case. It's believed that the abductor may have approached Gail under friendly pretenses, perhaps asking about or playing with the raccoon, which would have lowered the young girl's guard. This theory aligns with the family's statements that Gail was a trusting girl who loved to share her unusual pet with others. It also fits the evidence of her being seen conversing by the road with someone just before she vanished. Personally, this is a case I want to see solved in a big way, and I hope that I can bring more attention to Gail Joyner's case. Given the age of the potential suspect, the monster who did this is potentially still alive and well, and may be living free. Apprehending the person responsible would also allow Gail's family to finally have closure after more than 50 years. Jeff Haig was a 16-year-old scout from Morristown, Tennessee. In February 1970, he joined a small group hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park near the North Carolina-Tennessee border. The outing, led by Scoutmaster Eugene Smith, included Jeff and two fellow scouts, Lee Smith and Steve Wolf. On Sunday, February 8, 1970, as the troop was hiking out along the Appalachian Trail after an overnight camp near Icewater Spring, Jeff became separated from the group. He had paused to rest at the junction with the Boulevard Trail and offered to wait for his friend Lee, who was walking a few minutes behind. Believing this delay would be brief, the scoutmaster allowed Jeff to remain there while the others continued toward an upcoming parking area. He had expected the two lagging boys to catch up shortly. Unfortunately, this would be a fateful decision. Jeff never reunited with the group and was never seen alive again. When the others realized Jeff didn't arrive as planned, a search was initiated. It's unclear exactly how the confusion unfolded, but by that evening it was apparent Jeff was missing in the wilderness. The location where he was last seen is a high elevation area of the Smokies, not far from Icewater Spring Shelter. Winter conditions at that altitude were harsh at the time. Reports note that temperatures were sub-freezing with a foot or more of snow on the ground. Park rangers and volunteers mobilized quickly to find the lost scout. On February 8th and 9th, 1970, once Jeff was reported missing, rangers began scouring the trails near his last known point. By Monday, February 9th, the search intensified despite severe winter weather. Teams of National Park Service personnel and local rescuers scoured the Appalachian Trail and connecting paths. 5 rescue squads, guided by 15 park rangers, covered over 30 miles of trails on foot that Monday, February 9th. According to local newspaper reports, by February 10th, Jeff was still believed to be alive. Through the week, dozens of personnel continued the hunt. Searchers battled steep forested terrain and often poor visibility. Canine units were used repeatedly, and ground teams methodically checked trails, shelters, and drainages. Despite these efforts, days passed with no sign of Jeff. Morale remained cautious. Given the brutal conditions, rescuers knew time was against the teenager's survival unless he had found shelter. After over a week of fruitless searching, a major breakthrough came late in the afternoon of Monday, February 16th. A U.S. Army search team, assisted by a group of search dogs, made a crucial discovery in a remote area known as Walker Prong, a stream drainage southwest of Jeff's last known location. They found almost all of Jeff's camping equipment and extra clothing neatly piled on a large boulder in the middle of the Walker Prong stream. The items included his knapsack, sleeping bag, cooking gear, a sweater, a glove, 2 pairs of socks, pants, a toothbrush, a can opener, and an unopened can of ravioli. Because of fading daylight and the forbidding terrain, searchers couldn't immediately follow where any tracks might lead from the boulder that afternoon. Nonetheless, this was the first solid clue in 9 days, and it shifted the focus of the search to the rugged Walker Prong Basin. 2 days later, on Wednesday, February 18th, search teams finally found Jeff Haig, tragically deceased. Using the clue of the gear, searchers combed the Walker Prong drainage and ultimately discovered Jeff's body at the base of a 20-foot cliff in that area. He was found less than 2 miles from the trail junction where he'd vanished, in a remote valley off the trail. Notably, his body was located not far from where his belongings had been dropped, confirming that Jeff had traveled down along the stream bed. When Jeff's remains were recovered, they revealed perplexing details about his final moments. He had succumbed to the elements, described by one report as a frozen body, indicating death by hypothermia and exposure. Strangely, Jeff was missing one of his boots, and several articles of clothing were fully or partially removed. In fact, his pants were found mostly down and his socks were off when his body was discovered. These observations strongly suggest that Jeff experienced advanced hypothermia, which can trigger paradoxical undressing. This is a phenomenon where severely hypothermic individuals feel overheated and irrationally remove clothing. Park officials concluded that Jeffrey Haig's death was a tragic accident resulting from disorientation and exposure in extreme winter conditions. There was no indication of foul play, and all evidence pointed to an attempt by Jeff to save himself that went awry. Authorities speculated that after being left alone, Jeff likely became lost and tried to find his way to safety by following the Walker Prong stream downhill. They concluded that he was trying to reach a highway which is located near the stream, but that tragically, due to the conditions, he was unable to do so. Over the years, Jeff Haig's disappearance and death have been re-examined by park officials and independent researchers alike. Most agree on the fundamental cause, that he succumbed to hypothermia after losing his way, but a few lingering mysteries and questions surround the case. Many observers have attempted to tie his partially undressed state to potential foul play. Having researched the case, I have to disagree with this. The state in which Jeff's body was found is best explained by the effects of severe hypothermia. As the body's core temperature drops, victims often become disoriented and may shed clothing in a desperate attempt to cool an illusory overheating. The fact that Jeff removed boots, socks, and pants despite freezing temperatures aligns with this well-documented phenomenon. This explanation accounts for the odd condition of his attire and suggests his final actions were driven by delirium and physiological responses, not a clear mind. Authorities at the time leaned toward this explanation, considering the evidence of discarded clothing and the frigid environment. However, an admittedly more unusual factor in this case is why he headed downhill to the stream at all. The search leaders believed he likely panicked after realizing he was alone and left the trail, possibly believing that following the creek would lead him out of the woods. Later observers have questioned why an experienced scout would do such a thing, as it goes against the most basic rules of outdoor safety. I note that while articles have played up Jeff's experience, at the end of the day he was still just 16 years old. Further, anyone, regardless of their experience level, can start making irrational decisions when panic sets in. Others have pointed out that it remains somewhat puzzling why an experienced scout would abandon most of his supplies. The neat piling of gear could indicate he initially halted to camp and then changed his mind, or simply that he tried to mark the spot, intending to return. We will never know his exact thought process, but the evidence suggests an urgent push to hike out of the mountains that unfortunately led him deeper into peril. Some have suggested that these odd factors may indicate that he was chased by either a human or an animal. Notably, this case has been covered by David Paulides, who ascribes the entire incident to something supernatural. In my view, despite significant unanswered questions, all the hard evidence we have at present indicates that this is a case of a young man who tragically perished due to exposure. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and most importantly, share this video with your friends and family. On a late May day in 2023, a young English tutor in Busan, South Korea, welcomed what she thought was a new student into her home. The visitor, a petite woman dressed in a high school uniform, appeared to be a shy teenage girl. In reality, she was 23-year-old Jung Yoo-jung in disguise, and the ordinary tutoring session quickly turned into a nightmare. Within hours, the tutor was brutally slain and chopped to pieces. This shocking crime set off a police investigation that gripped the nation. Detectives raced to uncover how an unemployed true crime fan with no prior criminal record had executed such a horrific plan. Jung's crime was as calculated as it was gruesome. Investigators would later learn that she spent months preparing for this moment. Posing online as the mother of a 9th grade girl, Jung contacted over 50 different tutors through a tutoring app until she found one who lived alone and agreed to meet. On May 26, 2023, Jung arrived at the 26-year-old tutor's apartment in Busan's Gumjeong district, wearing a school uniform she purchased online. Being short and youthful-looking, she was able to pass as a high school student, and the unsuspecting tutor let her inside. Once indoors, Jung launched a frenzied attack, She stabbed the tutor repeatedly, over 100 times according to prosecutors. The brutality didn't end there. Jung left briefly to buy large trash bags and bleach, then returned to methodically dismember the body in the victim's own home. She also collected the victim's phone, ID card, and wallet, aiming to leave behind no traces of the victim's identity. Jung later told police she wanted to commit, quote, the perfect crime, making it seem as if her victim had vanished without a trace. After packing many of the body parts into a large suitcase, Jung changed out of the bloody school uniform into the victim's clothes and called a taxi. Her plan was to dump the remains in a remote area by the Nakdong River under cover of darkness. However, as she loaded the heavy suitcase into the cab late that night, the taxi driver noticed a red substance seeping from the luggage. He also noted Jung's demeanor, which he described as being weird and unusual. Sensing something was very wrong, and that the substance was likely blood, the driver alerted the police after dropping her off. This quick-thinking tip would prove crucial. Police rushed to the wooded area by the river and discovered the abandoned suitcase filled with the tutor's remains. By the next day, May 27th, authorities had identified and arrested Jung before she could cover her tracks. A search of her residence revealed additional body parts that she had left behind, along with blood-stained clothing. Investigators also recovered the victim's belongings in Jung's possession, tying her irrefutably to the crime. Confronted with mounting evidence, including CCTV footage of Jung carrying the suitcase and the victim's ID card found on her, Jung's initial composure began to crack. She changed her story multiple times during interrogation, first claiming she had merely found the victim already dead, then alleging she committed the act in self-defense during an argument. These lies quickly fell apart. At the urging of her family and faced with incontrovertible evidence, Jung eventually confessed fully to the horrific act. The case moved swiftly through the justice system. Jung was indicted, and in July 2023, her trial began at the Busan District Court. And yes, I had to double-check that timeline with multiple sources because it just didn't seem right to me. But yes, her trial started on July 14th, 2023 for the May 27th, 2023 slaying. The courtroom heard chilling details of her premeditation. Detectives revealed that Jung had searched online for ways to slay a person and then dispose of a body in the months leading up to the attack. Library records showed she had obsessively borrowed books about real-life perpetrators, which the prosecution argued was inspiration for her. It also came to light that just a day before the act, Jung had attempted to lure another potential victim. She invited a young woman for a walk by the river, but abandoned that plan when too many people were around. She had even tried to trick a teenage boy into meeting her earlier, but the boy became suspicious and declined the meetup. These facts painted a picture of a determined individual hunting for a victim, bolstering the prosecution's argument that the crime was coldly premeditated rather than impulsive. In November 2023, Jung Yoo-young was convicted of the slaying of the tutor, along with other related charges, and received a life sentence. The judge noted that Jung committed the act despite not knowing the victim beforehand for her own disturbed reasons, and called her lack of empathy alarming. Jung's attempts to claim psychological issues, she had pleaded that hallucinations drove her to the act, were firmly rejected by the court. Psychological evaluations indicated Jung scored high on psychopathic traits, meaning she showed a cold lack of remorse or normal emotion. To put it simply, she was found to be a psychopathic predator, not an untreated person suffering from psychosis. While prosecutors initially sought the death penalty for the shocking nature of the crime, the court opted for life in prison. South Korea technically has a death penalty on the books, but has not carried out an execution since 1997, reserving it for only the most exceptional cases. Jung's life term was upheld on appeal in 2024. Even after Jung's conviction, one haunting question lingered. Why would someone go to such lengths to slay an innocent stranger, quote, out of curiosity? While the media has reported that she did it out of her love of true crime, a deeper dive into her case reveals there's significantly more at play here. The complexity of Jung Yoo-jung's motives has been the subject of intense scrutiny by police, psychologists, and the public. No single explanation seems to fully explain the situation, but several theories offer insight into what drove her to commit this atrocity. In court, prosecutors argued that Jung's actions stemmed from deep personal resentment. She had struggled for years, failing to get into college and unable to find a job, and reportedly harbored anger toward her family over her situation. Evidence presented at trial showed that days before the act, Jung even made threats to her own father during a phone call. This suggests a buildup of rage and frustration in her personal life that may have sought a violent outlet. Taking out someone successful, in this view, was a twisted way for Jung to vent her accumulated anger and sense of powerlessness. Some experts believe the choice of victim wasn't random like she claimed it was. The victim was a 26-year-old university student, enrolled at a prestigious school, and a freelance tutor living an independent life. Though the identity of the victim isn't publicly known, it's been speculated that she may have been from a prosperous family as well. Jung, by contrast, had been isolated and unsuccessful in her academic and social endeavors. A forensic psychologist observed that Jung kept the victim's ID card instead of discarding it, perhaps as a sick trophy. This forensic psychologist believed that Jung may even have kept the card as a way to fantasize about taking over the victim's identity. Further, it's been speculated that had she been given more time with the card, she may have used it to attempt to pass herself off as the victim in certain settings. While this is speculative, circumstantial evidence does indicate a fascination with adopting other identities. After all, she had pretended to be both the mother of a high school girl and a high school girl in the commission of her crime. Criminologists have pointed out that Jung's background and personality made for a dangerous combination. She had lived as a loner for 5 years, unemployed and withdrawn from society. This isolation may have fed her obsession and blunted her grasp on reality. A criminal profiler noted that she possibly could not differentiate the real world from the crime-filled virtual world she immersed herself in. According to this profiler, Jung's flattened emotions and antisocial tendencies likely made her capable of carrying out the gruesome plan she had fantasized about. All that said, Jung's own explanation for the crime was disturbingly straightforward. She told police that she did it all, quote, out of curiosity, saying her urge to know what it felt like was sparked by reading crime novels and watching TV programs. Now, before we get further into the evidence here, we already know that she attempted to fabricate evidence to save her own skin. For instance, she had claimed that she was suffering from hallucinations when all expert evidence says that she wasn't. Further, we know that she had the desire to commit a perfect crime. I suspect that anyone who has this sort of desire and commits to this sort of planning has multiple backup plans to escape punishment should she be caught. I think the important thing to remember is that these factors are not mutually exclusive. It's possible that all of them converged to drive Jung Yoo-jung to commit this horrific act. Life disappointments feeding her anger, complete isolation, a warped envy of someone else's life, a morbid fascination with slayings, and an absence of any and all empathy are a dangerous cocktail. In August 1942, a routine U.S. Navy patrol over the Pacific Ocean turned into a baffling mystery that remains unsolved to this day. During World War II, the U.S. Navy made use of blimps to patrol the coasts and guard against enemy submarines. In the early months of the war, Japanese submarines had prowled the west coast, sinking several ships and even shelling targets in California and Oregon. In response, the Navy bolstered its coastal defenses by deploying blimps for surveillance. The L-8 was one of a series of small L-class non-rigid airships originally built by Goodyear for advertising, which the Navy acquired to help patrol American shores. Though modest in size and crew, usually just 2 men, these blimps proved useful for spotting signs of enemy submarines and could even attack with small depth bombs. The L-8 blimp itself had an interesting history leading up to the incident. It took part in a notable mission in April 1942, delivering vital parts to the aircraft carrier USS Hornet in the Pacific, as that ship headed out to launch the Doolittle raid. By the summer of 1942, Blimp L-8 was based at Treasure Island near San Francisco and assigned routine anti-submarine patrols along the California coast. Its 2-man crew on August 16, 1942, consisted of Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Ellis Adams, both U.S. Navy aviators with experience in airship operations. On the morning of August 16, 1942, L-8 lifted off from Treasure Island at around 6 a.m. for a patrol over the Pacific waters just outside San Francisco Bay. Conditions were calm and slightly overcast, and visibility was good for several miles. The blimp's mission was to scour the ocean surface for any sign of enemy submarines within a 50-mile radius. After about an hour and a half of flight, as L-8 passed over the Golden Gate and headed toward the Farallon Islands, the crew radioed in a routine position report. At 7:42 a.m., Lieutenant Cody sent a message, quote, "Am investigating suspicious oil slick. Stand by." This was a significant report since oil on the water could indicate a submarine lurking below. It was the last communication ever received from the blimp. When L-8 failed to check in as scheduled, the Navy grew concerned. Repeated calls to the blimp went unanswered. By 8:20 a.m., the airship's radio silence had been noticed, and by 8:50 a.m., the Navy dispatched 2 aircraft to search for the missing blimp. At around 10:50 a.m., a Pan American Airways pilot reported spotting an L-class blimp floating over the Golden Gate Bridge, apparently under control and heading back toward base. Minutes later, another search plane saw the blimp near the coast, rising through the low clouds at about 2,000 feet. It became clear this was L-8. However, the blimp's movements soon grew erratic. Around 11:15 a.m., to the surprise of onlookers, L-8 suddenly descended out of the clouds and came down near Ocean Beach, just south of San Francisco. 2 Army coastal defense soldiers and local fishermen who saw the blimp dropping rushed to grab its guide ropes as the 150-foot airship brushed the beach sand. The gondola door was found hanging open, and inside everything appeared normal, except that the 2 crewmen were missing. Before the astonished would-be rescuers could secure the blimp, it lightened and gently rose back up into the air. L-8 drifted inland, cleared a coastal cliff, and slowly floated over the city. About 15 minutes later, the empty blimp deflated and settled gently down onto a street in Daly City, a suburb just outside San Francisco. Navy personnel and local authorities immediately swarmed the scene of L-8's very soft crash landing. They found the airship largely undamaged. The blimp's engines were idle, there was fuel in the tanks, and the radio was in working order. The cabin door had been latched open, suggesting it was intentionally propped that way during flight. Inside the gondola, all the required safety equipment was present and properly stowed, including a rubber life raft and 2 parachutes, but 2 inflatable life vests were missing. Those life vests were standard gear that Cody and Adams would have been wearing while flying over water. Aside from the crew, nothing else had vanished from the blimp. There was no sign of fire, struggle, or malfunction. Investigators even checked the blimp's bilge, the bottom compartment, and found a layer of dust. confirming that L8 had never touched down on the ocean. In other words, it hadn't crashed or landed in the water at any point, causing the men to bail out. The two men had simply gone missing in midair. The Navy launched an extensive search along the coast, but no trace of Lieutenant Cody or Ensign Adams was ever found. The disappearance of L8's crew left everyone grasping for answers. The official Navy investigation ultimately concluded that the most likely cause was a tragic accident during the patrol. The Navy surmised that one of the men might have opened the cabin door to investigate the oil slick, leaned out too far, and fallen from the blimp at low altitude. The second man, realizing his crewmate was in trouble, could have hurried to the open door and also been pulled out or lost his balance in an attempt to save him. This scenario would explain why the door was latched open and why both life vests were gone. With the sudden loss of two people, the blimp would have quickly become lighter and risen out of control, which is consistent with its observed behavior throughout the morning. The Navy considered this the most plausible explanation and labeled the incident an involuntary abandonment of the airship. Even so, officials acknowledged two nagging points that kept the case mysterious. No one on the sea's surface reported seeing the men fall, and much more curiously, no bodies or any other evidence was ever recovered. Over the years, many other theories have been floated to explain what might have happened to Cody and Adams in those fateful moments. Some proposed an enemy action, for example, that a Japanese submarine surfaced and somehow abducted the crew. Others pointed to possible foul play or human drama, with rumors ranging from a secret stowaway hiding on board who overpowered the men, to one crewman slaying the other. This last theory, which is pure speculation, points to the possibility of a personal dispute, which dramatically led to the dying man pulling the perpetrator out of the blimp. While this definitely has a Hollywood quality to it, I have to stress that this narrative is essentially straight-up fiction, with the only piece of evidence being that both men went missing. More outlandish theories have also been suggested, including rogue waves and alien abductions, but again, there's simply no evidence to suggest these events actually occurred. Personally, I think the Navy's investigation here likely got it right, at least on a balance of probabilities. And yes, that is to say that we will never know for sure what happened to these men, but we can have a fairly good idea. Late on February 28, 1986, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme left a Stockholm movie theater with his wife Lisbeth after a spontaneous night out with their son and his girlfriend. Palme had no security detail with him. He had declined a bodyguard that evening, which was not unusual for his private outings. As the couple walked home, a man came up behind them and fired 2 shots at close range. One bullet struck Palme in the back, fatally severing his carotid artery, and the second narrowly missed Lisbeth. Bystanders rushed to help as the perpetrator fled into the darkness. An ambulance brought Palme to the hospital, but just after midnight he was pronounced dead. The shocking slaying of a national leader on a public street left Sweden in disbelief and immediately raised the urgent question of who was responsible and why. Olof Palme was not a typical head of government. He was a charismatic social democratic leader and an outspoken internationalist who had led Sweden on and off since the 1960s. Palme's candid criticism of the regime in South Africa and his anti-colonial views earned him as many enemies as admirers. At home and abroad, conservatives reviled him, and some even spread rumors he was a secret KGB agent, while others hailed him as a champion of human rights. This divisiveness meant there was no shortage of potential foes. The immediate police response to Palme's attack was plagued by mistakes that would haunt the case. Crucially, officers failed to promptly seal off the crime scene, allowing bystanders to walk through and possibly destroy evidence. Communication breakdowns added to the chaos. For example, An early emergency call about the act was misdirected and never reached police in time. Other basic failures have been noted in the aftermath of the event. For instance, in the critical first hours, the perimeter around the area of the attack wasn't closed, and roadblocks along major arteries were extremely slow to roll out. As days turned to weeks, public confidence in the investigation waned. Under intense pressure to solve the crime, authorities poured seemingly unlimited resources into the hunt. Yet the investigation, led for a time by Stockholm Police Chief Hans Holmer, became chaotic, focusing on flashy but unproductive tactics while overlooking basic police work. For instance, Holmer held frequent press conferences of questionable value and even deployed military fighter jets to scour the city for the weapon. And no, you don't have to replay that part. Fighter jets were out there looking for a figurative needle in a haystack. You would think if they wanted to deploy some air power for this investigation, helicopters would be a more sensible choice than fighter jets. But hey, that's just my view. Meanwhile, more routine police work suffered. One veteran journalist noted that officers messed up routine tasks and failed to properly follow up on critical evidence in the early days. Perhaps the biggest blow to the case came in 1989, when prosecutors did manage to convict a suspect, only to have the verdict overturned due to serious police errors. One of the earliest and most persistent theories is that Palma was slain by a lone individual acting independently, rather than as part of a wider effort. The chief embodiment of this theory is Christer Peterson, a petty criminal who became the prime suspect in the late 1980s. Peterson was a local substance user and alcoholic with a history of extreme violence. And I'm not exaggerating here when I say extreme violence. He had already been in prison once for ending another life. In December 1988, nearly 3 years after the slaying, police arrested him after Palma's widow picked him out of a lineup as the man who committed the act. The following year, Peterson was convicted of the crime, seemingly providing closure to the case. However, the conviction was soon overturned by a higher court. The appeals court ruled that the evidence was insufficient and unreliable. Investigators had never produced the alleged weapon, and Peterson's motive for attacking Palma was unclear, but these were comparatively minor issues. Crucially, police had mishandled the lineup by tipping off Lisbeth Palma that the suspect had a severe drinking problem. Notably, Peterson appeared extremely disheveled while all the other men were well put together in comparison. She chose Peterson explicitly on the basis that he was the one who appeared to have a drinking problem and not entirely based on her own recollection. Notably, after being acquitted, Peterson reportedly boasted to his friends that he actually committed the crime. However, there's no evidence to suggest he did, and all evidence suggests that he was simply an extremely violent individual with a loose connection to reality. Another version of the lone wolf theory gained traction in recent years, focusing on a man who was at the scene but long overlooked as a suspect. Stig Engström was among the bystanders on the scene, and he built up something of a media profile in the years following the event. Engström openly disliked Palma's left-leaning politics and had significant weapons training from his military service. Decades after the crime, journalists and investigators pieced together inconsistencies in Engström's story. Multiple witnesses had described a man fleeing the scene who strongly resembled Engström, yet Engström himself claimed he stayed and tried to help. He gave statements about his movements that night which did not match known timelines, and he seemed oddly eager to insert himself into the media narrative of the crime. In a dramatic press conference 34 years after Palma's death, the chief prosecutor named Stig Engström as the prime suspect and formally closed the investigation. The only reason the case was closed is that Stig had passed away in the year 2000. Officials conceded that there was no direct evidence tying him to the act, but they argued that the accumulated clues pointed to Engström and no other suspect. This announcement was met with mixed reactions. While some observers felt the mystery had at last been solved, others criticized the conclusion as speculative and unfulfilling. In viewing the evidence, I understand why so many in Sweden were left empty with this announcement. There was no hard evidence whatsoever indicating he actually did it. It looks as though he could have been an individual who just wanted to insert himself into a high-profile police investigation. Anyway, I'll come back to this in a moment, after I discuss some of the other theories of the case. Another leading theory stretches far beyond Sweden's borders, pointing the finger at the South African Intelligence Service. Stunning allegations to this effect emerged in 1996, when a former South African police officer testified in court that his country's security forces were behind Palma's attack. He named a variety of known South African spies and mercenaries as being in on the job. Olaf Palme was a vocal opponent of South Africa's regime. Just a week before his death, he had given a fiery speech condemning their system of governance and declaring it had to be abolished. Swedish investigators flew to South Africa to follow up on these leads. They interviewed witnesses and suspects, but ultimately found no evidence to substantiate any of the claims. The government had fallen by then, and no official records ever tied South African intelligence definitively to the crime. Despite the lack of evidence, a former head of Swedish intelligence went on the record indicating that forces within South African intelligence were his top suspects in the crime. Among the more disturbing theories are those that suggest the act was an inside job carried out or covered up by figures within Sweden's own police or security services. Given the errors in the investigation, some have wondered if malice, and not just incompetence, played a role in the failure to catch the perpetrator. This line of speculation usually points to Palma's domestic enemies. Palma had aroused intense hatred from certain circles in Sweden, including some elements within the police and military due to his liberal policies. Another theory suggests that, as improbable as it may sound, the entire event was simply a random act of violence. Notably, Palma was out and about without a security detail, and it's been suggested that the perpetrator may have simply targeted him at random. While this sounds improbable, it's technically a possibility as well. Almost 40 years later, the authorities are no closer to solving the events of February 28, 1986. Personally, I suspect that due to the police mishandling of the initial investigation, we'll never get a clear resolution to the case. The police announcing that Stig Engström was likely the perp, and then closing out the case, feels to me like an attempt at saving face by the Swedish police. I don't understand how they could say with such certainty that they had enough evidence to close the case based on the evidence they presented publicly. I suspect that if Stig were alive, there wouldn't have even been enough evidence to convict him based on the very weak circumstantial case presented. Anyway, if you're Swedish or follow this case closely, I'd love to hear your take on what happened in the comments below. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to share this video with your friends and family and post it on your socials. This is the best way you can ensure that my channel keeps growing and that I can keep spending all my time on working to bring you great new content. Nikola Tesla was a visionary inventor whose New York City laboratory was a hub of groundbreaking electrical experiments in the 1890s. By 1895, Tesla's lab on South Fifth Avenue had become the epicenter of his research into alternating current, wireless lighting, and early radio technology. The equipment and prototypes housed there represented years of work and innovation. All of that changed in a single night when a sudden blaze consumed the building, marking a devastating turn in Tesla's career. In the early morning hours before dawn on March 13th, 1895, disaster struck Tesla's lab. A fire broke out in the downtown Manhattan building at the South Fifth Avenue unit that housed his workspace on the 4th floor. A night watchman on duty had just been tending the basement furnace. When he returned to the ground floor, he discovered flames had completely engulfed everything. He exited the building and alerted the authorities immediately. By the time firefighters arrived, flames were roaring through the stairwells and the elevator shaft of the six-story structure. The building was also occupied by a steam fitter supply company, and the floors were soaked with machine oils that helped the flames spread with frightening speed. Firefighters battled the inferno for over 3 hours, but the structure burned quickly. The heat grew so intense it even ignited parts of a nearby elevated railway line. By dawn, the fire was finally controlled, but Tesla's lab was completely destroyed. The entire fourth floor collapsed into the stories below, burying the remnants of Tesla's machinery, tools, and notes under charred debris. When morning came, the extent of the loss was clear. Virtually all of Tesla's inventions, equipment, and research notes had been reduced to ashes. Priceless models and prototypes, including those Tesla had displayed at the 1893 World's Fair, were gone. Tesla was crushed by this sudden ruin. Witnesses say he paced in front of the smoldering wreckage in disbelief and grief. Financially, the fire was a severe blow. Tesla estimated at least $50,000 in damage to his work, an absolutely huge sum at the time, and none of it was insured. The scientific community and the public responded with an outpouring of sympathy. Newspapers lamented the calamity, with one editorial calling the destruction of Tesla's lab a misfortune to the whole world. For investigators, the pressing question was what sparked the blaze. Official inquiries at the time were hampered by the complete destruction of the interior, but they determined that the fire started on the building's ground floor, well below Tesla's lab. All evidence pointed to an accident. The ground level and basement were work areas filled with flammable substances, making them prime candidates for the fire's origin. One likely scenario was that an open flame, such as a gas light the watchman left burning, ignited the oil-soaked surroundings. The blaze's rapid spread was clearly fueled by the building's hazardous contents. Investigators found no indication of foul play or sabotage. In their report, the fire was ultimately attributed to an unfortunate accident, a common hazard in an era of open gas lighting and combustible materials. Over time, several alternative theories have emerged to explain the cause of the 1895 lab fire. Some have wondered if one of Tesla's own experimental devices or electrical systems might have triggered the fire. Some modern theorists have wondered if a machine could have overheated, or a stray spark from a high-voltage coil could have smoldered and ignited something after hours. This theory, however, isn't backed by contemporary reports or evidence. Tesla and his assistants had left for the night, and the blaze, according to all evidence that we have, began on a different floor. Perhaps the most common theory is that the fire was no accident at all, but an intentional act by someone who wanted to halt Tesla's work. Tesla's breakthroughs with alternating current and his futuristic ideas made him a high-profile figure who some rivals or industrial interests might have seen as a threat. In this scenario, a competitor or disgruntled foe could have set the blaze on purpose to sabotage him. However, there is no proof of any such plot. The official investigation found no hint of arson, and Tesla himself never accused anyone of wrongdoing. Given their history of bad blood, Thomas Edison is frequently hinted at as the mastermind behind the fire. While it's entirely possible that industrial sabotage was involved, especially given the state of forensic investigations in 1895, there's simply no evidence to support it. Personally, I see the more interesting mystery here as not how the fire started, or if one of Tesla's rivals was involved. Rather, I wonder what sort of state-of-the-art inventions went up in smoke, and what exactly was contained in his lost papers. Given the exponential nature of scientific progress, and given that the fire happened in 1895, I have to wonder how much more advanced we would be if it hadn't happened. Well, I mean, it wouldn't be us, but the equivalent humans in the same situation. Mike Herron was a 51-year-old father of two from Tennessee who vanished under baffling circumstances in 2008. He split his time between a condo in Maryville and a 100-acre farm in the remote Happy Valley area adjacent to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Also, I swear the Smokies come up so much in my videos, I could probably create a 2-hour Smokies compilation. Mike ran a construction business and was an avid outdoorsman who had even worked as a national park trail cutter. On the morning of August 23, 2008, Mike headed out to work on his farm. He called his sons to let them know he'd be out of contact, since cell phone reception there was poor. After picking up a lawnmower from one son's house, he arrived at the Happy Valley property. Around 11 a.m., neighbors saw Mike leaving his farmhouse on a green Yamaha Wolverine ATV, waving as he drove down Bell Branch Road. This was the last confirmed sighting of him. Over the next 2 days, Mike's family became concerned when they couldn't reach him. On August 24th, friends noticed his pickup truck parked at the end of his driveway, with a trailer and mower still attached. This was odd, since he usually would have unloaded the equipment and moved the truck closer to the house. Mike's parents checked on him that day and found no sign of their son, and the grass he intended to mow was untouched. Panic didn't set in just yet, though, especially since he owned a large property and also spent a significant amount of time in the outdoors, where he disconnected from the outside world. By Monday, August 25th, with no word from Mike, his sons went to the farm and also visited his Maryville home. They found his car and motorcycle still in the garage and discovered that Mike's keys, cell phone, wallet with cash and cards, and even his weapon were left inside the truck at the farm. Authorities launched a large search operation in the rugged area as soon as Mike was reported missing. Heavy rain rolled in on Monday evening, likely washing away tracks and scent trails. Despite this, more than 100 people joined the search, including sheriff's deputies, national park rangers, state wildlife officers, and local volunteers. They covered roughly 450 acres of woods and about 50 miles of trails over the next several days, together with search dogs and a chopper. Yet the exhaustive effort found absolutely no trace of Mike. A single concrete clue turned up on Tuesday, August 26th. A family friend discovered Mike's missing ATV abandoned in dense brush about a mile from his house. It lay on a steep hillside near an old cabin, close to the national park boundary. The ATV was undamaged, but it had been left in high gear with the ignition switch on and the battery fully drained. Mike's sons noted he was meticulous and would never leave his four-wheeler running like that unless something was very wrong. The location was also off course according to his sons and wasn't near any path Mike normally took. While finding the ATV was a critical development, it didn't solve the mystery, not even close. There were no footprints, torn clothing, or any sign of a struggle around it. Searchers intensified their efforts in that area but found nothing else. After weeks of searching, no further evidence turned up, and the sheriff publicly acknowledged that the lack of clues was baffling. In the absence of clear evidence, several theories have been proposed to explain Mike's disappearance. One possibility is that Mike had an accident in the woods. Perhaps he walked away from his ATV and fell or got injured. However, the ATV's condition and the thorough search of the area make an accident seem doubtful. If he were lost or hurt nearby, searchers likely would have found some trace of him, but they found nothing at all. Notably, the area is home to black bears and other wildlife, so some wonder if a bear attack could explain his disappearance. Authorities found no evidence of any animal attack or any signs of a large predator in the area. Without any such signs, an animal encounter is considered unlikely, though admittedly the weather conditions could have covered up such evidence. The most common theory, however, is that Mike met with foul play. Mike might have interrupted illegal activity on his property, such as trespassers or a hidden substance operation, and been silenced by someone who didn't want to be caught. According to his sons, he was known to confront intruders on his land, or his neighbor's land, though in the past it appears they had been there unintentionally and non-maliciously. According to one of his sons, if he had seen anything suspicious going down, he would have immediately confronted that person or people. All these factors make foul play a strong possibility, even though no proof of a struggle or any crime whatsoever has been found. Another theory is that Mike chose to disappear intentionally, which appears to me to be a more absurd theory than usual in this case. This theory seems to get brought up in every missing person case, and usually there's something to suggest this was the case. Perhaps the person who went missing was in debt, or their life wasn't going well in other ways. With Mike, all evidence suggests he was a successful business owner who owned a large piece of land and had a happy family. Is there such a thing as a boring number? The interesting number paradox is a famous logical puzzle that tackles this question. It starts by attempting to label natural numbers as either interesting, having some notable property, or uninteresting. At first, this seems reasonable. Surely some large random numbers have nothing special about them. However, a clever twist in logic shows a contradiction. If any number were truly uninteresting, it would become interesting by virtue of being the smallest uninteresting number. In other words, every natural number can be argued to be interesting. This outcome is why it's called a paradox. It defies the initial expectation that boring numbers exist. The reasoning behind the interesting number paradox is usually presented as a proof by contradiction. It goes like this. Assume there are some uninteresting numbers. If so, there must be a smallest uninteresting number in that group, because the natural numbers have a well-defined order starting from 1. For the purposes of explaining this potential paradox, let's call this number n. By being the lowest number with nothing interesting about it, n suddenly has a unique property. It is the first number with no interesting traits. That very status makes it interesting. This is a contradiction. N can't be both uninteresting and interesting at the same time. Therefore, our initial assumption must be wrong. The conclusion is that there are no uninteresting numbers, meaning every number is interesting in some way. Despite its interesting conclusion, the interesting number paradox isn't a formal mathematical theorem. It's more of a logical trick that hinges on how we define interesting versus boring. One key limitation is that interestingness is subjective. The paradox arises from an incredibly subjective definition of what makes a number interesting. Essentially, the act of declaring a number uninteresting gives it a new property by default, meaning our original definition was flawed. If we try to formally split numbers into interesting versus uninteresting, the boundary between the two sets breaks down. The smallest so-called uninteresting number can't consistently belong in either category, meaning that the uninteresting set just simply doesn't exist. If we accept the paradox, no natural number is uninteresting. However, this doesn't mean that all natural numbers are equally interesting, given that interestingness is a linguistic term rather than a mathematical term. But that raises the question whether something like a prime number without linguistic significance is more interesting in the context of this thought experiment. Also, as I'm editing this, just to clear that up, prime numbers don't have linguistic significance outside of a mathematical frame of reference. So put down your pitchforks, please. Notably, most mathematicians disagree that this is an actual paradox, but rather a byproduct of non-mathematical language. All that said, this fails to account for the fact that on a linguistic level, it does represent a paradoxical situation as relates to specifically defined number sets. The phenomenon commonly referred to as Truman Show disorder is a rare psychiatric issue in which an individual believes they're the star of a reality television show. This delusion takes its name from the 1998 classic film The Truman Show, starring Jim Carrey. In this movie, Truman Burbank gradually discovers that every aspect of his life is being broadcast to millions of viewers around the world. While Truman Show disorder isn't an officially recognized diagnosis, it has garnered attention in both clinical settings and popular media due to a handful of reported cases. To put it simply, from a psychologist's or a psychiatrist's point of view, clinicians don't typically write Truman Show on a patient's chart. Instead, psychiatrists diagnose the condition that best fits the patient's symptoms. These are generally a psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, delusional disorder, or bipolar disorder with psychotic features. In these cases, the belief of being monitored 24/7 functions as the delusional theme of the psychotic disorder rather than a standalone disorder itself. Symptoms can include an unshakable belief that one's life is being manipulated by outside forces, as well as heightened hypervigilance regarding cameras or believing people are actors. Individuals suffering from the delusion also may act in ways that are considered strange or unusual, given that they believe they're the star of a show, rather than just going about their life. This causes some people to completely withdraw socially in the hope of escaping perceived surveillance and the quote-unquote stardom they believe they have achieved. Notably, the Truman Show disorder itself is somewhat controversial. Because it isn't a recognized diagnosis, there's debate over whether giving it a label risks sensationalizing or trivializing a serious mental health issue. Some critics argue that focusing on the catchy name draws attention away from the broader issue of treating individuals with persecutory delusions. However, this criticism is by no means universal, and some argue that naming the phenomenon can help clinicians recognize the cultural context in which certain delusions arise.